Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I am very privileged to have the opportunity to present a bit more of a conversation we started earlier with Morse Tan. He is a distinguished academic by training, the author of myriad articles and a very important book about North Korea and international humanitarian law. We'll be talking a bit about that. But he's also served our country in a very important post during the Trump administration as the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. And in that role, he was actively involved in trying to expose a problem with which he has wrestled, I think it's fair to say, most of his life. That is the dangerous regime in North Korea and what it is doing to its own people and what it threatens to do to, well, ours and others, including the people of South Korea. Morse Tan, I'm so pleased to have a chance to continue some of the discussion that we had earlier, specifically with respect to this problem of genocide being conducted by the North Korean regime. You've actually gone to school on genocide, notably that the Chinese Communist Party has been accused of inflicting on the Uyghurs of Western China and other ethnic minorities. Tell us a little bit about how that experience has informed your professional judgment that what we're witnessing now is something akin, happening on an even larger scale to the people of North Korea.
There are a few times in the last quarter century where there's official atrocity determination made for genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. And that's exactly what happened against the Chinese Communist Party, got across the finish line on January 19th. But to support that decision, there was a thick pile of documentation and documents and evidence that supported it. And there is certainly no less evidence available, even public record that is available, not even getting to classified things that support that for North Korea. And they are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. Genocide also against anyone who's not fully ethnically Korean. That's one of the genocide categories that are there. And so this is something...
Christians are subjected to some of the worst of this mistreatment. But the people of North Korea more generally are as well. It's not unique to specific enemies of the state. It's happening on just an epic scale, which is the subject, of course, of your book, North Korea, International Law and the Dual Crises, Narrative and Constructive Engagement. Give us a sense of your findings as you assessed the full magnitude of the violations of international law, an armistice with the United States and South Korea, and what you've described as arising to actual war crimes as well as crimes against humanity. This is a stunning set of charges and very important to a topic we'll turn to in a moment.
Yes. This was true not only in terms of committing war crimes during the Korean War in the early 50s. This has extended throughout its time. One example that I'll give is when the North Koreans captured the U.S. vessel, the USS Pueblo, and the way they tortured the American servicemen and the way they were trying to exploit and use them for their propaganda purposes, all the ways they violated the Geneva Convention. Along these lines, this is one of the examples I've written about and laid out. This is one of many, many examples where they have violated the Armistice Agreement, committed war crimes, and are trying to get away with that. And one of the ways they think they can get away with it more is if there is a peace treaty that will...
Or even a declaration of peace, which would presumably conduce to a peace treaty. And we're unfortunately on notice, really, that not only would that give them sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card on the whole humanitarian front, but it might actually be highly counterproductive with respect to the central purpose of this notion, which is being promoted by the regime of Moon Jae-in in South Korea and by some in the United States Congress at the moment. I'm a little unclear what the attitude of the Biden administration is to it, but walk us through how the effects of such a declaration of peace would probably translate into something that is very different from peace.
Yes, the concern is that the current administration in South Korea would utilize such a thing to demand the exit of the UN command and U.S. forces, which is the biggest deterrent to North Korean aggression in restarting the Korean War in a full-scale sort of way. And so the irony of it is it would actually undermine the peace on the peninsula rather than enhance it. And so that is a huge concern. I'm empathetic and sympathetic with the desire for divided families to reunite, for Korean Americans to reunite with those in North Korea. That is the focus.
Hailing from South Korea yourself, you doubtless know of many people whose lives have been upended by this sort of forced divisions.
Yes, indeed. And that is something that is in the Senate version, but there is not a necessity to engage in what the House version is saying in order to try to promote the reuniting that is there.
In fact, I'm told that this House version, H.R. 3446, makes no mention of human rights at all, not just family unification, but really the whole problem that the North's behavior in regard to human rights represents. And just to drive this point home, if what you're trying to do is, yes, alleviate the suffering of the people of North Korea and engender greater degree of connectedness, for want of a better term, between people in the North and people in the South, but under the rubric that you're going to actually stabilize the peninsula and minimize the chances that there could possibly be a reversion to, God forbid, a Korean War 2.0, your conclusion is that actually, whether by design or perhaps simply by miscalculation, you might well find yourself precipitating the kind of invasion of the South that the North engaged in the past and apparently still has as a matter of, a policy goal.
Indeed. Yes, that is the case. And
it's chilling.
It is.
And so were you to talk with sponsors, for example, of this legislation in this country, or for that matter, as you did when you were ambassador at large for global criminal justice, to senior members of the Moon government in South Korea, what would be your principal argument against taking this step to perhaps decouple South Korea from the United States, the defense arrangements that have kept the peace on the peninsula all these years?
This is very much playing into the hands of what North Korea has angled for all along. And so if the U.S. forces are no longer even there or no longer committed to defending the Republic of Korea, then this is the biggest invitation that can be given towards a 2.0 version of a full-scale Korean War, which was disastrous. And my own parents were children in the midst of that war. And so the irony of this, and note too, you're talking about North Korea. They persistently and consistently break the international agreements or treaties of any kind that they have, and they do it very quickly and easily for their own gain, and they enter into it for their tactical gain. And so this is the pattern of North Korea, And so to trust that North Korea would abide by such a thing, it's North Korea's supposed commitment is not even worth the paper that is put on.
Yeah. This is all the more stunning because, as you say, we've had a lot of experience with the North Koreans, and to think they would behave otherwise is delusional, at the very least.
Yes.
When you talk about the possibility of a new conflict on the Korean Peninsula, I think it's fair to say that given the kinds of military capabilities that the North now has, that it didn't back in the 1950s, to say nothing of the fact that it may be the fourth largest military on the planet, but the other three, China, Russia, the United States, would almost certainly be embroiled in such a conflict, as they were to varying degrees in the last one. The possibilities that even just a miscalculation might wind up putting us in this very dangerous pass, to say nothing of essentially playing into the hands of the North, because this has been part of their agenda from essentially the interruption, shall we say, of the 1.0 version of this conflict.
That's correct. That's correct.
Staggering. So let me just ask you, if you were the advocate for human rights at a moment like this, talking to those in the Congress of the United States who generally profess a very strong commitment to respect for human rights, the dignity of man, opposition to repression, and certainly to genocide, what is it you think might be the most compelling argument that what is afoot here is actually going to, quite apart from whether it results in another conflict, which is very bad for, as they say, humans and other living things, but that would be at odds with those presumably deeply held values and convictions?
Yeah, sadly, the current administration in South Korea, the Moon administration, has gone the other direction from upholding justice and human rights. They, in fact, have twisted it into saying that those who are advocating for such things or to bring true information to North Korea are jeopardizing the peace and security of South Korea by doing so. But without justice, peace is at best shallow. And we are the United States of America, who have represented ideals of liberty and justice for all to the world and have been a beacon as such. And we should not abandon that commitment. And rather than persecuting those who are engaged in such efforts in South Korea, as the Moon administration sadly has done, we should be strengthening and upholding that and being a champion for that in a way that we're better situated to do that here in the United States than anywhere else, including South Korea. And so we have a special place to play. And generally speaking, North Korean human rights has been a bipartisan sort of thing. Most things in regards to North Korea have been overwhelmingly bipartisan, almost unanimously so, generally speaking. To be snookered into thinking that you have this peace declaration and somehow that's going to make things better with respect to the Korean Peninsula is misguided at best.
I'm reminded of our recent, very unsatisfactory, to put it mildly, experience with Afghanistan, where we were told that the United States was simply going to end an endless war, only to discover that the only way you really can unilaterally end an endless or other duration war is effectively by surrendering. And whether you call it a surrender or whether you just walk away and you leave everything, including a lot of military equipment, for example, in Afghanistan, to the enemy, the Taliban, it does not end well, that's for sure. And I just find it almost unimaginable that people would think it would be different with a North Korea that, as you've said, their deployment of their military forces and their stated policies and their history all suggests remain their abiding determination to continue this war.
Yes.
Violently if they can.
Indeed.
So, Morse Tan, to the extent that you're looking at a challenge to our national interests of the first order, I would argue, and you're finding a lot of people, averting their gaze or indulging in kind of wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've given a lot of thought to what would be an alternative approach to North Korea to try to achieve a betterment of the condition of the people there and hopefully an end to the threat the North Korean regime poses to us. And I want to ask you, as we discuss this, if you might draw upon some of your experience with Donald Trump, who approached the North Korean conundrum, which he was told, I think, on day one by Barack Obama, was the thing he worried most about in terms of the legacy he was leaving behind, is the possibility that things could go very badly in North Korea.
Yes.
Donald Trump set about trying to change that prospect. Talk a little bit about that, as well as your thoughts about where we go from here.
Sure. On the one hand, I think it is helpful and important to have humanitarian aid, cultural involvement, true information getting into North Korea, and things along these lines. This would be very helpful. On the other hand, in terms of a diplomatic approach and posture, it must be robust and strong, and that is what was going on during the last administration, because the North Korean government operates on the basis of force, and they pay attention and listen to very little other than that. They don't genuinely care about their own people. They care about holding on to power, and they care about their military might and using force in all sorts of ways, domestically and abroad. And so a strong approach that's backed by the greatest military that the world has ever known, namely the U.S. military, is the only approach that even has a chance of potentially succeeding. And the past administration got closer than any other to doing so. This was recognized by the author of Becoming Kim Jong-un, who's in the current administration. And I think that is simply an accurate description of where things are and how best to approach things with North Korea. It must be a very robust approach. And I've said this all along myself.
So this is essentially what my old boss Ronald Reagan used to call peace through strength.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
willingness certainly to engage
Yes.
diplomatically, but with everyone on notice that
Yes.
there was an alternative, and certainly the United States had the Trump card, if I can use that expression.
Yes.
Now, it's interesting because, Morse, you doubtless were very aware of some of the criticisms that were sent Donald Trump's way for this notion that he was going to demilitarize the North Korean regime by his winsome ways with the dictator there, Kim Jong-un, that he was being naive, he was recklessly disregarding the accumulated expertise and savoir-faire, if you will, of the diplomats who had been engaged in these endless rounds of negotiations with the Kim regime, going back to its predecessors for that matter, and to say nothing of the central role that we were told the Chinese Communist Party had to play in any kind of effort to come to terms with North Korea. How did you look at it as a man who obviously was hopeful of achieving great things in a portfolio that had been too long neglected? Did you see it as an opportunity, or did you think, well, this is a fool's errand, it's going to undermine all of your other work?
I saw it as a great opportunity and the closest we've ever come along these lines. I think it was being seen realistically and with clear-eyed, non-wishful thinking. I think there was...
By President Trump and...
Yes, I think there was a basic understanding of the nature of the regime and how they operate. And so I think that came out, and there was, in my view, a better job done than ever before, and we, I think, came closer to moving towards more positive directions. And you know, we had.
I understand one of the reasons why was that this fundamentally challenged the North Korean regime, disorganized it, one might say.
It did.
Is that why you thought it was so promising an opportunity?
Yeah, it interrupted the normal cycle that North Korea engages in to precipitate a crisis, get to the table who they want, negotiate benefits, swallow those benefits, destroy and violate the agreement, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. It did a great job of interrupting that cycle. And it did not go the way they usually want it to go. And so that was, I think, very well done. You know, look, we got our people back. Secretary Pompeo once said publicly that was one of the most satisfying things that was achieved, was bringing our people back.
Hostages that the North Koreans had taken.
That's correct. We got remains back from soldiers who had died in the war. There were no missile launches during that time. Things were moving in a better direction. And
it certainly seemed to have lessened the tensions that were rather acute, even in the earlier days of the Trump time. Let me ask you then about where we are now, post-Trump. We've reverted more or less to form. We're knocking at the door, trying to get the North Koreans to enter into some sort of negotiations with us without preconditions and presumably enabled by the Chinese Communist Party again. Your prescriptions for what we should do now, I think, are very hopeful, and I want to give you a chance to give us an uplifting message of how this could be different if we conform to a different approach.
Sure. I believe that the North Korean regime is so unjust that it will, as you look at other things in history that have been so corrupt and so unjust, it is a matter of when and how it will be relegated to the dustbin of history, not if, is what I believe. And so I have great hope that over the sweep and arc of history, that a regime like North Korea will not be able to stand persistently over time. And the sooner we can see the day where there can be a just, peaceful reunification of the Koreas, that
not on the North's terms.
Correct.
By definition.
Correct. The contrast of the success of each of the respective systems of North and South Korea is dramatic and stark. The North Korean systems have failed miserably, and it's should be obvious to anyone who is attempting even the slightest bit of a fair assessment of the situation, which systems have operated and worked better for the benefit of the people that are there. And so
will conduce to an enduring peace.
Agreed.
As opposed to the pretense of one that will shortly have to be shattered, presumably.
Agreed.
And Morse, this is a life's work for you, and I want to really thank you for what you've done, both in academic circles as well as in your writings, and not least by any means in a senior government position, holding accountable people who violate international humanitarian law, to say nothing of armistices that hopefully prevent war, is just absolutely vital, I think. And I think your critique of H.R. 3446 is absolutely right on. And it's urgent that those who are supporting it understand that what they are about could be not only detrimental to the human rights of people in North Korea and perpetuating this odious regime, but quite possibly enabling it to get us back into another Korean war on the worst of terms. Thank you again for joining us, and I want to say thank you to the rest of you for doing the same. This conversation has been bracing in terms of what it teaches us and what we must do about it now. I hope you'll join us for the next edition of The Big Picture. Thank you for today's.